All right, so we are back for part 2 of the monkey's paw, which will cover part 2 and part 3 of the story. So just kind of to review, we have the White family that lives in kind of a remote area. And Mr. White was waiting for his friend, Sergeant Major Morris, to come and just meet with them. And we know that he's been traveling for the military, and he does talk about how he was in India and he came across a monkey's paw, which will give 3 different wishes to 3 different men. And he says that it's been magic has been placed on it by a fakir, and he ends up throwing it in the fire. He's very weary about it and says, it's not something that might bring you something good. And that people tend to get greedy. Well, Mr. White ended up taking it out of the fire and went against what his friend was telling him. And even still, Sergeant Major Morris was telling him, it's not a good idea. I wouldn't do that if I were you. But ultimately, we know that after Sergeant Major Morris left, that Mr. White did, in fact, wish on it for some money. He did feel it move in his hand, which kind of freaked him out. But nonetheless, still made the wish and still has the monkey's paw. So we are right up at the top where it says part 2. In the brightness of the wintry sun next morning, as it streamed over the breakfast table, he laughed at his fears. The room felt as if it always had, and there was an air of health and happiness which was not there the previous night. The dirty, dried-up little paw was thrown on the cabinet with a carelessness which indicated no great belief in what good it could do. I suppose all soldiers are the same, said Mrs. White. The idea of our listening to such nonsense. How could wishes be granted these days? And if they could, how could 200 pounds hurt you, father? Might drop on his head from the sky, said Herbert. Morris said the things happened so naturally, said his father, that you might, if you wish not, see the relationship. Well, don't break into the money before I come back, said Herbert, as he rose from the table to go to work. I'm afraid it'll turn you into a mean, greedy old man, and we shall have to tell everyone that we don't know you. His mother laughed and followed him to the door, watched him go down the road, and returning to the breakfast table, she felt very happy at the expense of her husband's readiness to believe such stories, all of which did not prevent her from hurrying to the door at the postman's knock, nor when she found that the post brought only a bill talking about how sergeant majors can develop bad drinking habits after they leave the army. Herbert will have some more of his funny remarks, I expect, when he comes home, she said, as they sat at dinner. I know, said Mr. White, pouring himself out some beer, but for all that, the thing moved in my hand. That I'll swear to. You did it, said the old lady, trying to calm him. I did it, replied the other. There was no thought about it. What's the matter? His wife made no reply. She was watching the mysterious movements of a man outside, who, looking in an undecided fashion at the house, appeared to be trying to make up his mind to enter. In mental connection with the 200 pounds, she noticed that the stranger was well dressed and wore a silk hat of shiny newness. 3 times he stopped briefly at the gate and then walked on again. The 4th time he stood with his hand upon it, and then with sudden firmness of mind pushed it open and walked up the path. Mrs. White at the same moment placed her hands behind her, hurriedly untied the strings of her apron, and put it under the cushion of her chair. She brought the stranger, who seemed a little uncomfortable, into the room. He looked at her in a way that said there was something about his purpose that he wanted to keep secret. He seemed to be thinking of something else as the old lady said she was sorry for the appearance of the room and her husband's coat, which usually wore in the garden. She then waited as patiently as her sex would permit for him to state his business, but he first strangely sat. So she's saying right there that she's waiting patiently as a woman would to permit the state of the business. I was asked to call, he said at last, and bent down and picked up a piece of cotton from his trousers. I come from Ma and Megan's. The old lady jumped suddenly as in alarm. Is anything the matter? She asked breathlessly. Has anything happened to Herbert? What is it? What is it? Her husband spoke before he could answer. There, mother, he said hurriedly. Sit down and don't jump to a conclusion. You've not brought Bad news, I'm sure. He and eyed the other, expecting that it was bad news, but hoping he was wrong. I'm sorry, began the visitor. Is he hurt? Demanded the mother wildly. The visitor lowered and raised his head once in agreement. Badly hurt, he said quietly, but he is not in any pain. Oh, thank God, said the woman, pressing her hands together tightly. Thank God for that. She broke off as the tragic meaning of the part about him not being in pain came to her. The man had turned his head slightly so as not to look directly at her, but she saw the awful truth in his face. She caught her breath and turning to her husband, who did not yet understand the man's meaning, laid her shaking on his hand. There was a long silence. He was caught in the machinery, said the visitor at length in a low voice. Caught in the machinery? Repeated Mr. White, too shocked to think clearly. Yes. He sat staring out the window and taking his wife's hand between his own, pressed it as he used to when he was trying to win her love in the time before they were married, nearly 40 years before. He was the only one left to us, he said, turning gently to the visitor. It is hard. The other coughed and, rising, walked slowly to the window. The firm wishes me to pass on their great sadness about your loss, he said without looking around. I ask that you please understand that I am only their servant and simply doing what they told me to do. There was no reply. The old woman's face was white, her eyes staring, and her breath unheard. On the husband's face was a look such as his friend, the sergeant major, might have carried into the first battle. I was to say that Maud Meggins accepts no responsibility, continued the other, but although they don't believe that they have a legal requirement to make a payment to you for their loss, in view of your son's services, they wish to present you with a certain sum. Mr. White dropped his wife's hand and, rising to his feet, stared with a look of horror at his visitor. His dry lips shaped the words. How much? £200 was the answer. Without hearing his wife scream, the old man smiled weakly, put out his hand like a blind man, and fell, a senseless mass, to the floor. All right, so we know that, in fact, Mr. White did make that wish for £200, and it seems as if it has been granted, okay? But it did cost the life of the son, okay, Herbert. So that leads us to part 3.